Hey, what's up everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I went over the ways in which the colonists reacted to the Intolerable Acts, how things changed once the shooting began, and what exactly drove the colonies to declare independence ultimately in July of 1776. In this episode, I'm going to get into the actual war. But before I do that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel get noticed, get to more people, and certainly enables me to do more and more of this. So if y'all like what you're seeing and hearing, please like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. It would be lovely. Thank you very much. As always, at the beginning of these episodes, I lay out what the resources are that I use to compile the information for the episode. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to give y'all a question to think about as I'm going through the details of what happened. In this case, the question is, what were the general strategies of each side in the Revolutionary War? And how did each side end up accomplishing or not accomplishing its objectives? I'll say that one more time. What were the general strategies of each side in the Revolutionary War? And how did each side end up accomplishing or not accomplishing its objectives? So that's something that you want to think about as I'm going through all of this stuff, with the idea being that at the end of it, you should be able to speak intelligently at length to answer that question. Or perhaps write an essay about it, the way that I've had students do in the past. So to compose this episode, the resources I used are not really any different from the past few episodes. I will quickly go through them. There's The American Pageant, which is a U.S. history textbook usually used in AP U.S. history courses. There's also Give Me Liberty, another AP U.S. history textbook. There is John Adams, the biography written by David McCullough. There is Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham, which is another biography. Both of those, John Adams and the Thomas Jefferson biography, both won the Pulitzer Prize. The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783 by Joseph J. Ellis. And then The Glorious Cause, The American Revolution, 1763 by Robert Middlecoff, which is part of the Oxford History of the United States series. In the last episode, I discussed the ways that the colonies responded to the Intolerable Acts, how they came together and formed the Continental Congress, what that body did in terms of organizing the association, the boycott of British goods, how the Continental Congress created a sense of unity and political purpose among the colonies and the colonists. I talked about the ways in which the Continental Congress and individual colonists tried to reach out across the Atlantic to Britain to make the British government and British citizens understand where they were coming from and why they were taking the actions they were taking, why they objected to what the British government had done. And then ultimately I talked about how the British government declared the colonies to be in rebellion. That precipitated the first violence at Lexington and Concord. And then I mentioned the ways in which things deteriorated from there as the colonies simultaneously prepared for war and tried to patch things up with the British government. Ultimately, the British government was not very receptive to things like the Olive Branch Petition, and so the colonies decided in the summer of 1776 to declare their independence. And that is where we pick up here and talk about first the situation facing the new United States of America and the situation facing Great Britain. Because they both had different challenges on paper, and I think it's fairly apparent that if you were betting on one side versus the other, you'd probably much rather have money on Great Britain if you didn't know anything about what was going to happen. Great Britain was one of, if not the, greatest military powers in the world at this time. Great Britain was almost certainly the greatest naval power in the world at this time. Great Britain was one of the great, if not the greatest commercial powers in the world at this time. Great Britain had a larger population and a much more professional and organized military than the colonies did. And all of that pointed to Britain being this Goliath to the colonies' David. And it was understandable why colonial leaders like John Dickinson looked at the situation and said, man, do we really want to be doing this? I'm not sure this is a great idea. But many of the leaders like John Adams, like Samuel Adams, like Thomas Jefferson, like Patrick Henry, they believed very strongly that what was happening was wrong, that the colonists were being deprived of their rights as Englishmen, and that despite the odds, they had to go forward with this, and that if they hung on long enough to get Britain's many rivals involved in the conflict, they could win. They could make this a war of attrition, and they could make it so painful for Britain that Britain would feel no choice but to finally just let them go. And there were colonists, too, that understood that these colonies were not super valuable in Britain's eyes to the British Empire, and that perhaps making this just a colossal pain in the ass for Britain might make Britain sort of go, is this really worth it? What are we doing here? Which is kind of ultimately what happened. But before I get into the general stuff, let's talk about some of the particulars, because looking at it from the colonial point of view and trying to even look at it from, just an objective, neutral observer's point of view, it's a pretty daunting thing that the colonies are facing going up against Great Britain at this time. And here are the reasons why. The colonies had, as I mentioned in a number of previous episodes, rarely cooperated with each other in any meaningful way, and many leaders in the state and local levels had just no connection with each other. The Continental Congress was a beginning, yes. They had formed the association, yes. They had formed these committees of correspondence even before the Continental Congress, sure. But it was definitely anathema to the colonies' way of existing, certainly prior to the French and Indian War, and even in the years between the French and Indian War and the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It just wasn't the way that things worked in the colonies. They operated, as I've said before, like 13 separate little islands. Even in the years, and this is something I'll get into later, after independence, it takes a while for Americans to start thinking of themselves as Americans and not as Virginians, North Carolinians, Connecticuts. I have no idea what the hell people from Connecticut call themselves. I really don't. New Hampshireites, New Yorkers, whatever. It took a long time for people to start thinking of themselves as Americans rather than as residents of their particular states. So you can imagine if that was the case, there's an expression that a lot of historians use that says that before the Civil War, people said the United States are. And after the Civil War, people said the United States is. And the Civil War is nearly a century after all of this. So it's demonstrative of just how difficult it was to get everybody on the same page in the 13 now states to think of themselves as one people. That was just not how things worked up until this point, and it took a while after for it to work that way anyway. That's a big challenge, getting all the states now to cooperate with each other and coordinate with each other, which was pretty necessary given what they were up against. Another challenge that the United States faced was that there were loyalists all over the place in the 13 states. And what do I mean by a loyalist? I mean somebody who continued to think of himself or herself as a British subject, maybe as English or as Scottish or whatever, but as certainly someone who was British and not American. And that was, most estimates are around 15 to 20% of people in the 13 states thought of themselves as loyalists. And there are sort of like pockets of them. Loyalists are not evenly distributed throughout the colonies. There are kind of these pockets of loyalists. A good example of one is New York City. There were a lot of loyalists in New York City. It's not an accident that New York City was occupied by the British for most of the Revolutionary War, because it was pretty easy for the British Army to get itself set up there with all the loyalists who kind of welcomed, not kind of did welcome, the British military when it invaded and took over in 1776. But that's a challenge in and of itself, when you have a number of people in your midst who are not only not on board with the revolution, they're actually quite hostile to it. In addition to that, soldiers in the U.S. Armed Forces were largely militia. I discussed what that was in the previous episode, but I'll repeat it here. It's kind of an informal military organization organized by the community. These people who are members of the militia train together. They're not regular or professional soldiers. And that means kind of what you might think it would mean, which is that they do not have the kind of training, the kind of discipline, the kind of adherence to military structure that is really important for military forces to be successful. And it's a consistent challenge throughout the entire war, as long as fighting is going on, to have these informal groups of American soldiers, often organized into militias, fight together with discipline and to stay under the command of other people, as is kind of consistent with the whole American ethos of this time. A lot of these militiamen are pretty allergic to people telling them what to do. They don't like authority. They like following and being a part of a military force with people they know. They want to make it local. And that's also just a constant kind of push and pull that's going on throughout the revolution, is this notion of, I am loyal to my state, to South Carolina, to Massachusetts, to Pennsylvania, and that's what I care about. And this whole national project, I'm not really sure I'm so hot on that, and I'm not really sure that I even know what that means, and that I want to take part in something that is going to subsume my community, my state, and become something that I am unfamiliar with. That's something that a lot of participants in the Revolutionary War think and feel and write about and say. There's a lot of historical record that covers this. So that is a big issue, just maintaining military discipline, getting a professionalized military in place, keeping these guys who are volunteers in order, and something that is constantly an issue throughout the war, desertion. You see in the letters of Washington, of Hamilton, of all kinds of officers in the Continental Army and in various militias that they are constantly talking about, I had a bunch of troops just wander off and I don't know where they went. Or I'm down half my forces because these guys needed to go home and check on their families, or they needed to go home and take care of the crops they had to harvest, or whatever it is. It's very difficult for the United States to keep an army in the field as the fight goes along. It's really wrangling cats. It's pretty crazy if you dive into what it was like for commanders of the Revolutionary War. Man, oh man, was it a difficult task to just keep things together and orderly. So that's another challenge. The United States additionally had no navy to speak of. They had what are called privateers, people that were like professional pirates who were sort of paid by the U.S. government to just cause as much chaos and disorder to the British Navy and to the British Merchant Marine as they possibly could. But that's about it. There's a few armed ships here and there, and there's guys like John Paul Jones, who becomes a famous naval officer. You know, he famously was in that battle where his ship is torn up and he's like, I've not yet begun to fight. And that actually happened. That was a real thing. But John Paul Jones, is the exception. There's just not a whole lot of naval forces that exist to help the Americans combat the British, who have the best navy in the world. And the fact that the British have the best navy in the world doesn't just make it difficult in terms of trying to win fights on the open ocean. If that were the only issue, it probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal. The reason it's an even bigger problem that the United States has such a modest, almost non-existent naval presence is that the United States at this time is really reliant on waterways for transport, for trade, for any kind of moving around. And whether that is the Atlantic Ocean, the coast, which every state almost has some coastline on the Atlantic Ocean at this point. But even those that don't or don't have much, they have rivers. And those rivers are navigable Americans depend on those waterways to get around because, as far as roads are concerned, you don't have much of anything going on. And those roads that do exist are pretty unreliable. It's not like you had paved roads at this point. You know, the weather gets a little bad and there's just no using the roads a lot of the time. So the British could control all of these navigable waterways, and it meant that it was very difficult to transport troops, to transport supplies, to even communicate between any significant distance was really hard because the British totally controlled things. One more thing that I'd mention in terms of the Navy that illustrates this problem: the Battle of Long Island, which took place in the summer of 1776 and is what allowed the British to invade and take over and occupy for the duration of the Revolutionary War, New York City. Washington's army really did try to solidify itself in a way that would prevent a British invasion of New York because they saw that coming. And despite having a long time and putting a lot of effort into fortifying New York against a British invasion, there was just nothing they could do once the British Navy sailed into their position. It was totally one-sided because the British had such a superior naval advantage to the Americans, and all the fortifications that the Continental Army set up in preparation for the British invasion amounted to pretty much nothing. Another challenge the Americans faced, and this you and I are probably going to be a little less sympathetic to, but it does matter in terms of the American perspective on how they're going to defeat the British military forces. Virginia's Lord Dunmore, by November of 1775, so 6 months, more than 6 months, before the Declaration of Independence even occurred, declared that any slaves who tried to escape their owners would be set free and would be welcomed by British forces. And in a place like Virginia, where half the population is African slaves, that poses a real challenge because not only do they have to worry about these British forces, they also have to worry potentially about a slave insurrection, if not a massive slave exodus. Those are both things that people in Virginia, people in South Carolina, people in Georgia, any place where there is a substantial population of slaves, and it's not just the southern colonies either. New York had a pretty substantial population of slaves, by way of example. Those are concerns that the colonists have to pay attention to. There's no shortage of fear among white Americans at this point about slave insurrection and what that might mean. That has been on the minds of a lot of slave owners and non-slave owning white people for decades by this time. I've discussed it in previous episodes. So, though we are certainly much less sympathetic to white Americans at this point saying, oh, my slaves are going to leave, oh, woe is me. I mean, it might seem that way, but if you're just looking at it from the point of view of revolutionaries in America and challenges they face when trying to defeat this British force, worrying about a slave insurrection or worrying about losing a bunch of your labor force is something that they had to consider. Another challenge that the United States faced, you see a pattern here, right? This is really difficult. They are stacked up against it. Money. As is the case with any revolutionary group who are either trying to start their own country or break away from an existing country, money, financing, providing for that revolutionary force and for those people is a gigantic challenge. And that was certainly the case for the 13 now independent states of the United States of America. Provisioning the army and militias was difficult, and troops very frequently went hungry and without even basic clothing. I have read over and over again in these books descriptions of the troops as in the militia or in the Continental Army, descriptions of the troops as naked. And I take that fairly literally. I mean, I don't think they literally had nothing on, but I think it was pretty close to that from the descriptions that I have read. They certainly did not have shoes or winter clothes of any kind, and they were often described as being dressed in rags, and I think that's kind of literally what it was. I'm amazed, frankly, that as many soldiers survived the experience of places like Valley Forge as they did, because going through a eastern Pennsylvania winter is no joke. especially when you don't have adequate clothing. So that was a real challenge. And when the troops are to be resupplied, that's a real difficulty too, because the farmers who would supply them with foodstuffs, maybe with some kinds of linens or materials to make weapons or whatever, those farmers were very reluctant to take the kind of payment that either the states or the national government could offer. There was an expression, not worth a continental, that was used to describe the paper currency put forward by the national government, because it was a real challenge to have that currency maintain any real value. You know, inflation is always a challenge for governments getting up and getting going, and that was certainly the case for the new United States trying to manage its currency. And currency, of course, had been an issue in the States stretching way back to the pre-revolution days in the mid to early 1700s. On top of all of that, as the war dragged on, and the enthusiasm and the patriotism that a lot of Americans had at the outset when the shooting started and when the British were being cast as this evil despotic empire that was robbing them of their natural rights, that patriotism and fervor and zealous enthusiasm for the war waned, as it almost always does. It is very difficult for me to think of an example of an American war, and this is almost certainly true of other wars in other places, but it's very difficult for me to think of an example of an American war for which enthusiasm was as high at the end of it as it was when the war began. And almost every war I can think of, you read about how the country, Americans, they get sick of it. They want it to be over. I mean, maybe at the outset they're all for it and they're enthusiastic and they're patriotic and they want their country to win, but eventually everybody kind of gets sick of it. I mean, that was certainly my lived experience with the Iraq War and with the Afghan War as those continued to drag on for years. So the patriotism of 1775, 1776 really begins to wane by 78, even before then, and the troops had been through a lot. They're suffering. The people, average people, had been through a lot. They had all kinds of difficult experiences because of the war, whether they couldn't sell their goods, whatever they were producing, if they're farmers or if they're merchants, whether they had stuff taken by British soldiers, which happened pretty frequently, whether they had lost somebody or many somebodies. You know, families lost a number of people to the fighting through death or serious injury or maybe one and then the other. The war was a huge burden on a lot of people, and some people definitely experienced it more disproportionately than others. There's also, finally, the last thing I'll say in terms of difficulties facing the United States, there's also competition for resources, money, most notably, between the states who are competing for resources against one another, and there is competition between the states and the national government. That makes things really difficult, and it's not just competition for resources, whether that's money or whether that's foodstuffs or whether that's weapons or gunpowder or any of the kind of stuff that is required to keep the fighting going. It's also competition for authority. And that is something that does not go away when the revolution's over. The problem of who has the final say on what will happen when a state or when the group of states disagrees or has contradictory ideas to what the national government wants, that only begins to be illustrated when the war begins. And it's something that the new United States has to deal with after the revolution's over. I mean, and we're still having these arguments now. There's still a lot of where does the federal government's authority end and the state government's authority begin and vice versa. That's still a conversation that we're having, and I don't think that'll go anywhere, like, ever. So it is a thing that in the midst of a war, the Americans are trying to figure out, and it's difficult. All right, I want to move on from the challenges that the United States is facing to the general strategy, because I think that is important to understand as we examine what the states and the national governments were doing during the course of the war. Understanding what their goals were, how they thought they would win, is a way of understanding why they did what they did, whether that's, again, at the state or the national level. Most state leaders and members of the Continental Congress understood that the United States was not going to win its independence without help from France, from Spain, from the Netherlands, all of whom are rivals at one time or another with Great Britain. These people understand they are not single-handedly in face-to-face, hand-to-hand combat, or even in a guerrilla warfare kind of situation, are not going to be able to defeat Great Britain on their own. The financing is too much of an issue. Acquiring gunpowder is too much of an issue. Although I do have to say there is kind of an alternative argument to this, which has been presented in both some of the materials that I've read, that I've listed for this episode and for the others, and in materials that I have not mentioned that I've also read, whereby the historians, the authors, will say that even without European intervention from France, from the Netherlands, from Spain, all of whom did eventually intervene on behalf of the United States would have won anyway. Because it is so vast a territory, because people were so committed in the United States, Americans were so committed to the cause of independence by the time it was declared, because the bad blood had gotten so bad between Britain and the now United States that reconciliation was impossible, and that as the expression is, the only way out is through. And that was the thinking of a lot of Americans. There are historians that put forward that argument, and I think there's something to it. I do think that it is a great deal of land to try to subdue. It is a lot of people to try to put under your control if you're Great Britain. There's thousands of miles of ocean that you got to cross over. There are even people at home in Britain who did not understand the war and thought it was ridiculous and thought, why the hell are we doing this? We're fighting our own colonists? That's what we're doing? Why don't we just give them what they want? Why don't we just give them their rights? It's all of these things that, in addition to the intervention by France, especially, and eventually by the Spanish and the Dutch, that make Britain ultimately decide, okay, this isn't worth it. We need to just let go of the colonies. From the way they talked about it, they let go of the colonies. And from the American perspective, obviously, it's the United States. But I do think that it's easy to imagine, without intervention from Britain's rivals, that this doesn't work out. That the United States become exhausted and they just can't keep it up anymore. So I think that is a realistic thing to imagine. And it is the more persuasive argument to me that without intervention from Europeans, the United States Revolution, the American Revolution, does not work, does not succeed. Anyway, U.S. forces had suffered a really bad defeat at Quebec. That invasion did not go well, despite all the optimism about it. That's one difficulty. Washington, his whole plan was to fight what he called a war of posts. And what that means is a war in which the American armies and militias would fight from forts. That's what he means by posts, and would defend certain positions, and sometimes they wouldn't be forts, but there would be reinforced militarily positions that the Americans, to make the most of the resources that they had. Washington, did not envision that the United States would be successful, whether it's the Continental Army or the militias, just going head-to-head with Great Britain and trying to do stand-up traditional 18th century warfare as Europeans fought wars. Washington didn't see that as realistic. So he wanted to pick his spots and defend certain places, retreat strategically when necessary, and he knew that would be necessary, use the countryside and use defensive positions of the colonists and the fact that the British are invaders to the advantage of American military forces. That's how he conceived of the entire war effort. The British, their plan from their point of view, was to use Howe's forces, General Howe, who had taken over in Boston in the wake of the declaration of the British government that Massachusetts was in a state of rebellion. They were going to use Howe's forces in New York because he ultimately, of course, retreated from Boston. He let Boston go and then invaded and took over New York. Howe was going to launch an attack from New York, and he was going to meet General Burgoyne's forces, who were working their way down the Hudson from Canada. General Burgoyne's forces, were going to meet with Howe's, and they were essentially going to cut off New England, which was the heart of the rebellion. It was the most revolutionary place. They were going to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, using the Hudson River, more or less, as the defensive position. And they thought that by doing that, it would weaken the ability of the colonies, Americans, to defend themselves and to coordinate attacks and so forth. So that was their general strategy. Howe's going to launch an attack that's going to engulf more of the state of New York, and he's going to meet with Burgoyne, who's coming south from Canada along the Hudson River. The invasion of New York City is the first really devastating defeat for the Continental Army and for George Washington. It very nearly destroyed the Continental Army. It's actually quite fortunate that the Continental Army was not destroyed, and the war could have ended right there. There's a lot of historians that will write about it in this way, that had things gone differently when Howe's forces invaded and took over New York, that the whole effort could have ended there. Washington could easily have been killed. He was in serious mortal danger a couple of times because he liked to lead from the front and demonstrate his own bravery and hope that that would spread out to other troops under his command and other officers under his command, that his example would make them more courageous and more willing to fight. And there were a couple times where his officers, his junior officers, had to like ride him and be like, dude, you gotta get the fuck out of here. What are you doing, man? You trying to get yourself killed? It's not difficult to imagine Washington being shot down, and maybe that ends the war because he was just that critical to leading the military forces of the revolution and keeping everybody together. And that's something, again, you can read about, and I'll get into it a little bit more. Washington was directed by the Continental Congress to defend New York because the Continental Congress collectively came to the conclusion that New York had to be maintained, that it would be too big of a blow to the morale of the revolution and of the country and everybody fighting it and all the states if New York were to be taken captive and held, and that once New York was taken captive, it would be very unlikely that they would be able to dislodge the British from New York. And that's something I investigated quite a bit, actually, when I read about this stuff, because I heard sort of some kind of conflicting accounts, but ultimately it does look like Washington, kind of begrudgingly, he didn't necessarily think it was a great idea, felt obliged because of the orders by the Continental Congress to try to defend New York, so he did that. Washington felt honor-bound to try to defend New York. It fails spectacularly. Most of his army is almost captured. He's almost killed or captured a handful of times, but he does manage to retreat from Brooklyn to Manhattan and then ultimately up to White Plains, and he manages to get his army out. And there's like a number of close calls, like I said. It's a pretty crazy story that is really worth reading about in more detail if y'all get a chance. I'm just trying to go through the stuff in broad strokes, so I'm not going to get into it here, but it's pretty hair-raising to think like just how close it was that the revolution came to ending within a few months of the United States declaring its independence. Washington spent most of the rest of 1776 retreating from post to post, kind of as he had planned, although he certainly would have liked to retreat less, but it was at least a part of how he kind of envisioned things. He avoided a general action, as he called it, that he thought would destroy his army, in large part because he understood how inexperienced and undisciplined these people were. He knew his troops were not ready to stand up to British soldiers, some of the best soldiers in the world, who'd been in their army for years. And when it came to especially up-close fighting, because the way that these fights often worked is soldiers would each fire volleys at one another with their rifles, muskets. They were not super effective. These guns didn't have a real great range. And then it would come to hand-to-hand combat. And everything I've read says that the British were just way better at this, pound for pound, than the militiamen or the Continental Army was. That disparity lessened as the war went on, but especially in those early days, the British were just much better in the short hand-to-hand combat that would often decide a lot of these fights. So Washington, at this juncture, when everything is very fluid and when his troops are very inexperienced, he does not want to risk them against the British in a stand-up, general, traditional kind of fight. Washington's victories, which he does have, and which we all have heard of course, that he manages to get by kind of strategically retreating and then attacking when the odds are in his favor at Trenton and Princeton, and especially Burgoyne's defeat. And Burgoyne, as he is invading through the Hudson, it just goes miserably for him. He is attacked over and over again by American troops. He gets caught up in the wilderness, and he eventually, Burgoyne and his forces, get trapped at Saratoga. And once he's trapped there, he's surrounded and forced to surrender. And that, the Battle of Saratoga, which takes place in October of 1777, that is the real turning point. Now, it's not to say that once Saratoga is won, the Americans are definitely going to win the war. Far from it. But the reason Saratoga is so important is that it demolishes the British plan to have Burgoyne meet up with Howe. It signals to the French, probably this is the most important part, it signals to the French that the Americans are capable, that they are serious about this, that they are not just going to shy away from things when they get tough, and that they can inflict defeats on the British that are significant. It is news of Saratoga when it reaches France, where Benjamin Franklin already is, and he's been negotiating with the French for some time, and Adams has gotten there too. It's when news of that battle reaches France, when news of that victory reaches France, that the French then agree to conclude a treaty of alliance with the United States, which is a massive, massive coup on the part of American diplomats. Up until that time, the French had been providing gunpowder and some supplies just as a way to really get under the British skin and deal them, at the very least, an annoying set of setbacks in North America, which, recall, the French had had to surrender all of their North American holdings to Britain, and some of those went to Britain, some of those went to Spain, but France had been defeated recently by the British. Very recently, in fact, in the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it, and the French looked at this, at the very least, as an opportunity to weaken one of their rivals, maybe even more than that, to inflict a serious defeat on one of their rivals. And it was at the point when the Americans proved themselves through Saratoga, through Washington's victories, crossing the Delaware, at Trenton and Princeton, and sustaining themselves through the long and difficult winter at Valley Forge. All of that stuff contributed to the French saying, all right, this is a worthy investment. We're going to really step up and form an alliance with you Americans. We're going to help you out in a much more significant capacity than we have up to this point. And Valley Forge is not just important. It's just to give an explanation. It's kind of a wilderness location in eastern Pennsylvania where American troops hold up for the winter of 1777-78 under Washington's command. It's the Continental Army, and it's brutal, man. They are really undersupplied. As I said, a lot of them are half naked at least. You know, they don't have winter clothing, that's for damn sure. And they don't have adequate food supplies. There's an expression that is used a lot of times to talk about the soldiers in the Revolution who persisted through all of these difficulties. It's the winter soldiers. And the notion of the winter soldier who is persistent where the sunshine patriot is not is meant to convey that in this crucible of difficult warfare, it's the people who stick with things when they become very difficult that actually mean something to the cause, and that they are believers, and that forges bonds among people who go through something like that together that are very, very difficult to break. And now there is commitment where there wasn't. And yes, there were still desertions, and yes, it was still difficult to maintain unity and to keep everybody supplied. And there were still all kinds of challenges. Those didn't go away because a lot of guys had stuck it out at Valley Forge. Those problems persisted throughout the entire war, but it did form a core of officers and soldiers who saw through the revolutionary movement and made sure that it wasn't going to fail. So that's why Valley Forge is such a big deal. After news of Saratoga gets to Europe, Ben Franklin manages to conclude an American alliance officially with France on February 6th, 1778. So I'm going to stop here for now. I will continue this. I'm going to do another episode on the war, how it progressed from 1778 onward. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe if you've not done so already. You can also contact me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can text or leave me a voicemail at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks as always. Really appreciate y'all hanging out. Hope you got something out of it, and I will catch you next time.